Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate Cimino, and I serve as Executive Director of the Citizens League, and I am just really glad to be here with you today. We are excited to have a chance to get together and have a conversation about redistricting. So I want to thank you for coming. We've got a great turnout today. Over 100 people have joined virtually already, and I see you still coming in. So thank you for making time in your day, and hope that you have a good hour with us. I know you will. So Citizens League, most of you know, but for those who may not be familiar with us, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and our goal is to make public policy accessible to everyone and engage people in really understanding issues and generating good solutions and ideas for challenges that we face in our communities. We've been at this for nearly 70 years. We are based in the Twin Cities and we work statewide. And you are part of the Citizens League already because you're here at this event, and you can continue to be a part of our work. You can attend events, participate in projects and programs that we have year-round, and support our work. And to that end, I want to especially thank those of you who at the point of registration for this event decided to also make a contribution to the Citizens League. Special thanks to you. We are grateful for your support. So you're here for Mind Opener today, and Mind Opener is a long-time series of events that the Citizens League has put on. It used to be in person, and since COVID began, we've been doing this virtually, and it's been fun. We've got great turnout, great events, great panelists and conversations, and glad that you could join us. The goal of these Mind Opener events is, we call them policy learning events. And the idea is to open doors for all of us to learn more about and connect to policy issues. So our goal is not to stir up debate or get into arguments or like pit different perspectives against each other necessarily, but because there's plenty of that if you want it, no matter where you look, but rather to dig a little bit deeper and to explore the nuances and the complexities of really interesting and complex topics. And our hope is that when you come to a Mind Opener, that you leave feeling informed, feeling energized, interested, and with a really deeper understanding and the ability to make a choice to get more involved in that issue if you've determined that that's something important to you and your community. So our goal is to get behind the headlines of some of these topics, behind the talking points, and really dig a little bit deeper today. So I know a lot of folks have continued to join. Again, welcome, Citizens League Mind Opener today. I want to acknowledge folks from General Mills who are here today. General Mills is an organizational member of Citizens League, and they're doing this event as an employee learning event for their organization. So I just want to say thank you, General Mills, for being part of this event today as an employee learning event. And now I'm very excited to thank Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, who has been a fantastic partner on this series. They are the sponsor of this series, making it possible that we can bring Mind Opener to you at no cost. But importantly, they have also been a thought partner in developing with us really compelling programs on topics that we think have broad interest across lots of different people and lots of different parts of the state. It has been a great time partnering with you on these programs, Blue Cross, and specifically Bridget. So I want to introduce and welcome Bridget Callahan, who's here from Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. And Bridget, I would love if you could jump in and share a quick welcome and share perhaps why Blue Cross is interested in and continues to be a part of Mind Opener with us.
Thanks so much, Kate. Hi, everyone. I'm Bridget Callahan. I work at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, the Public Affairs and Civic Engagement Specialist. Blue Cross has been partnering with Citizens League for over 30 years now, and we're thrilled to be supporting the Mind Opener series and especially today's event on redistricting. You know, as a health organization, Blue Cross sees civic engagement and the work that the Citizens League does as integral to our mission of improving community health across the state. We have been championing civic engagement for 22 years through our nonpartisan civic engagement program, Citizen Blue, and we really believe that community health is shaped by the strength of the democratic process. You know, as part of that work, we know that the redistricting process has a big impact on voters and their ability to influence the policies that affect them and their health directly. Ultimately, we know that as our population changes, so too should our government. So I just want to thank the Citizens League for being a wonderful partner and convener of these conversations, and thank our fantastic panelists today too for coming together to discuss this important topic. Lastly, I want to give a special shout out to the many Blue Cross Citizen Blue members who are joining us for today's event and for their dedication to being informed and engaged citizens. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bridget, and welcome Citizen Blue and everyone from Blue Cross Blue Shield who's joining us today, and every one of you who has decided to come into the room today to learn more about this topic. We're glad you're here. We're glad that this is something important to you, and we hope truly that you gain from this and can move forward informed and with deeper understanding of this issue. Today's topic, of course, is on the issue of redistricting, and this is really one of those policy and political issues that is so important. It impacts every single one of us, every community, every neighborhood and block, but it can really be a bit removed from day-to-day life. The 2020 census, which unfolded in a really trying time during COVID, was unique. And so we did hear, everyone heard a lot about that and how that connects to the redistricting process. Might have been a little bit of a lighter thread of connection. So we hope today to really dig in on that. As you think of questions that you have, I'll invite you to either put them in the Q&A, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A, or you can put them in the chat, and you can either just send them to hosts and panelists, or you can send your chat to everyone. So if you have comments or links or information that you might want to share with others, you're welcome to do that as well. And we can get to as many questions as we can. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Blanca Martinez Gavinia, our new Director of Public Policy at the Citizens League. And Blanca is going to be moderating today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Kate, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here with us. I know that oftentimes when we hear redistricting, some of us might be even wondering what that is or how do we get into this topic. So I hope that after today you are left with that experience in being able to have this conversation and feeling really connected to this important issue. So to help us and walk us through this journey today, we have three amazing panelists who are going to really help us explore and really get into some of the nuance of what redistricting is. With us, we have Anastasia Belladonna Carrera, and I'll ask them to just wave quickly. And they are the Executive Director for Common Cause Minnesota. We also have Lexi Stengel, and she is the lead counsel for the Nonpartisan Senate Council, Research and Fiscal Analysis, Office of the Minnesota State Senate. And then also with us, we have Kevin Matzik, and he is with Lockridge Brindle Nguyen as a state government relations. So we are so excited to have them all here today. And we're gonna start with the very first question, which, and I'm gonna have Lexi, because Lexi does have a lot of that very impressive expertise and background. And Lexi, if you can just tell us a little bit about your background, your experience with redistricting. And the first question that I would love for you to take us through is why redistricting matters.
Great, thank you. It's so nice to be here with all of you. I think I've worked with all of you in some capacity in the past, so it's kind of nice to be in a panel of people that I know. That's always a little fun. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about redistricting. I think it's fascinating sort of from a legal technical standpoint, which is sort of what I'm here to share today with all of you. So I think there are a lot of reasons that redistricting is important, depending on the lens you sort of look at it with. And since I'm a lawyer, I'm going to look at it from like the legal requirement standpoint. So let me sort of take a couple steps back and sort of explain some of the basics about redistricting and how it works, so you sort of have a frame of reference for, you know, why we're doing this and why it's really important. So we talked about the census already a little bit, as Kate mentioned. It happened in 2020. The timeline was a little crazy. We've made it through that. But the census data is really important to a whole bunch of people for a whole bunch of reasons. It can determine what sort of federal funding we're getting for schools, things like that. But today I'm going to focus on why the census is really important for redistricting purposes. And one of the reasons that is what's called reapportionment. And as we know, there's 435 congressional seats. And when we get the census data, Congress actually looks around the different states and reapportions those so that the district have roughly equal population across the states. You might remember in the news several months ago, it was a really big deal that Minnesota got to keep its 8 congressional seats. And some states lost and some states gained. We kept 8. And that's really important because it tells the state what to do next. So now we know we have 8 congressional districts, but what does that mean for us? So the state will actually use the national population count from the census as well, but it's broken down into the state level, and it gets broken down through several different levels that gives a really good idea of how many people live where. And the state uses that for redistricting. And for those of you that might not be familiar with the basic concept, it's the idea of redrawing all of the districts in the state for federal, state, and some local offices. And this is done by what it sounds like, drawing maps, or sometimes they're called plans, to show what the new districts will be. So why do we need to do this? And it's a really core concept to a lot of people and to our government itself. And that's the concept of one person, one vote. And I'm sure many of you have heard this saying before. And it comes from a redistricting case from the Supreme Court in the 60s. And so what does this mean? It means that every district should be roughly equal in size, so that everyone in each district has about the same power as other people. And as we know, people move and populations shift over 10 years. So by the time the next census rolls around, the districts can be pretty far off of an equal population. So we redistrict every 10 years after the census, and it's like a reset. So the districts again are equal until the next, people start moving around, and we do it again in 10 years. And I think it's important to talk about who does redistricting, because that can be a little bit confusing with what we see in the news. So in Minnesota, the legislature is required by the Constitution to do redistricting for the legislative and congressional districts after each census. And the legislature does this by passing a bill like it does in other situations. A bill is introduced, heard, amended, passed, signed by the governor. And state law sets a deadline for the legislature to be done with this by February 15th of 2022. So I'm sure you've probably seen in the news, there was also a court case going on. Actually, it's several court cases that have been consolidated into one. So there's sort of the second and separate process that's going on right now in the courts. So several groups of people sued the Secretary of State saying our districts aren't equal. Court, can you fix this for us? Can you draw new maps? But because the legislature is constitutionally required to do it, the court isn't going to step on the legislature's toes. And they've said, we're not doing that until after the February 15th deadline. And if the legislature doesn't do it, we will. But of course, getting the community input and making all of the decisions takes time. So the court is sort of running a parallel process where they're gathering their own information, and they'll be ready with maps to introduce if the legislature doesn't meet the deadline. If the legislature does meet the deadline, the court maps just sort of go away. And one other thing that I think a lot of people talk about, and I think is really important for some of the other questions, is the concept of redistricting principles. And these are the things that guide people when they make their decisions on how they're going to draw their maps. We have some of these that are required by federal and state law, and that's things like making sure your districts are convenient and contiguous, which means they're easy to get around. And the Federal Voting Rights Act also requires that maps don't intentionally or inadvertently discriminate on the basis of race. So you're going to see that across all of the maps that are drawn. But the legislature and court can adopt additional criteria, and this is really where things might get sort of interesting. Some of the common ones include preserving cores of prior districts, compactness, but we've seen discussion from a variety of sources about how should you look at maybe using political data or not. So that's something that could be considered in a principle too. And these are sort of where the map drawers show what their values are and how they're making these selections. just to note sort of through the parallel process, the legislature hasn't adopted principles yet, but there are several bills floating out there that have had hearings, so you can see sort of the legislative perspective. And the court has already adopted its principles. It's also important to note local governments sometimes need to do redistricting. This is like county commissioner offices, some school board districts, some city wards, those sorts of things. And those don't happen until there's a legislative plan enacted. So you'll be seeing, once that happens, you'll be seeing some of your local communities doing their own redistricting process. And then where does that leave us now, which I think everybody is wondering. And it leaves us waiting to see what happens. So the legislative session starts on Monday. Like I said, the deadline is February 15th, so the legislature has time to get their maps enacted into law. If that doesn't happen, the courts will step in and release their maps sometime after the 15th. And while we wait, there's lots of plans already out there, either by the legislature or members of the litigation. And I'll put links to this stuff in the chat so you can see the various maps and a few other things. So that didn't quite answer your question, Blanca, but I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why this is important. One of which is because it's legally required, and we want to make sure that that one person, one principle in law is really upheld.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Lexi. I just wanted to do a quick follow-up. You mentioned that there's some parallel process where there's some community input, where there are folks that are actually engaging in this process. Are you able to talk a little bit as to what that has looked like in the last few months?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. So there have been several series of community meetings. So the courts have held, I forget, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 or 10. I think they did one in each congressional district and a couple others. The House Redistricting Committee has had several hearings as well as, and the Senate Redistricting Committee has had hearings as well. So different groups of people that are drawing maps are getting input from the communities. In my experience, I haven't been to all of them, but most of them are sort of a listening session. What's important to you? Tell us about your district. A lot of them sort of focused on communities of interest. How are you like your neighbors? What groups should be kept together? And sometimes that's geography, please keep our city whole. Sometimes it is an industry or something like that, an ag industry or a fishing industry or something like that. There's been a fair amount of talk about the hearings in northern Minnesota about how to keep tribal reservations together and how do communities identify around that area. So I think it's really hearing from people about, what's important to them and how they feel like they should be grouped with other people. And I think that's sort of the main takeaway that I got from all of the hearings.
Thank you so much. So I would love to hear from our other two panelists. So maybe let's start with Kevin. Kevin, why does redistricting matter for the everyday person?
Well, thanks, Blanca and Kate, for having me on here. Happy to be part of this discussion. Just a little bit of background. I spent some time at the legislature. I started in 2001, actually, as a committee staff person for the House Redistricting Committee, working on the committee process there. And the last time we did redistricting in 2011 and 12, I was leadership staff in the Senate and worked on the legislative process there. Now I work on government relations for Lockridge Grindle now. But in terms of the question, why is it important? It's hard for me to improve upon what Lexi had to say. It really does come down to one person, one vote, and making, as populations shift, we want to make sure that every district has proportional number of voters, citizens in each district, so that everybody has equal representation at the Capitol. And I think of it as well from a legislative perspective. Your legislators, whether they're House members or senators, they are representing an area of the state. They're representing you as your senator or rep, but that area. And so you want to make sure that every portion of the state is equally represented at the Capitol in the legislative process, based on, the number of folks that live in a particular area. And so, it's really important. You have the governor is elected statewide. He represents the entire state as the executive of the state, and the legislature is meant to be representative of different areas of the state. And so we want to make sure every 10 years that those representatives represent the equal number of people, and that all voices can be heard at the legislative process. That's really what I've experienced in my career at the legislature, is just making sure that your voice is heard at the legislature by your representative. And so that's why redistricting is important, that everybody has equal representation and a voice at the Capitol.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think that really speaks to why this topic is so important. In my previous work, working for the city of Ridgefield, I did testify at one of those committees to really speak of the city's need to really stay together as a community that is bound to be a majority, meaning that it has a high population of Latino, Latinx. So that was a really important aspect of who they are as a community, and keeping that community together was really critical. So that piece of representation is really critical as well. So let's hear from Anastasia. Anastasia, if you can just give us a quickly background about yourself, and then just tell us why you believe redistricting matters.
Thank you, Blanca. My background is in human and civil rights, constitutional law, and policy work. I started at Common Cause Minnesota, I think it was like in October of 2016, and I wanted to pick a flagship campaign that I felt really addressed the root causes of what we see playing out sometimes through dynamics of voter disenfranchisement, or the disconnection between what communities are asking for as far as policies or need, and what you see their elected officials actually adopting as policy priorities. And so if we see the power of the vote, this is how I like to kind of explain the dynamic to folks. If you see the power of the vote as seeds that you are gonna plant to yield a particular kind of crop, right? Then redistricting is literally the ground and the foundation where you would be planting that seed in, okay? And that shows you the immediate relationship between both redistricting and the power of the vote, and this idea that you heard Lexi talk about with regards to the one person, one vote, and you also heard Kevin talk about that. And so if the ground doesn't have the proper nutrients, say it's too acidic, no matter what the quality of that seed is or how well the farmer may tend to their fields, their crops are not going to be good for that season, right? So going back to the redistricting process, right? If the process isn't a process that is inclusive and transparent and accountable, right? That is able to maximize opportunity for community members, regardless of their political affiliations, are able to directly engage in that and inform the people that are drawing those maps about who they are and what they care about. And I know we're going to talk about that a little later in this discussion, but just to say, then, the power of my vote may not yield what I think I should be seeing from those priorities that my elected officials might be moving. And so since about 2017, we've been working to educate communities about the nuts and bolts of what redistricting is and how folks can get directly engaged. So our work is through a statewide grassroots democracy partner space and table. It's a nonpartisan space. It's called the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy. And we focus more on the issues within the democracy space and not necessarily the partisan dynamics of it. So in doing the work of informing grassroots communities, we partnered with the Minnesota Council of Foundations, and we led the work in getting folks to understand it, but also to start practicing what that community mapping looks like. There were various tools, very similar to Google's maps. When we put in the address to figure out like, where are we going, and we see that map show up, there are tools that are very similar to that. And so we led a variety of various, community mapping sessions since, earlier in the year through Zoom, making sure that people were comfortable in defining who they were as community of interest within their districts. We also did a lot of getting them ready and getting people to practice what it feels like to testify. A lot of folks have ideas they want to share, but they feel intimidated in those spaces of power. And so we just did practice runs and we did workshops on that with folks. We lastly did partner with some other of our democracy partners in the BIPOC space, Voices for Racial Justice, 1MN.org, and other lead trusted voices in communities of color from across the state to make sure that communities of color and other disenfranchised members of the community, they may be, you know, seniors, they may be, we've talked to a lot of small farmers in pockets of greater Minnesota that feel very isolated. We've worked with individuals from the disabled communities and learning more about their experiencing of democracy, right? Because we use the word democracy, but we don't really think about, you know, what does that mean? Who is that including? And is it accessible? And so we did that through an intervener in litigation. Lexi mentioned some of that. And the goal there was simply to make sure that communities of color and other disenfranchised members of the community that were experiencing the outcomes of redistricting had their interests heard as stakeholders in this process. And that was really important to us. When I say us in Minnesota, the Common Cause Minnesota base is multi-partisan. I don't use the word nonpartisan very much. I think that that's a very, I would say, sometimes very loosely used word. So I go on to explain what that means for us. At Common Cause Minnesota, we've got about 18,000 plus members, and they run the gamut of partisan affiliation. They are self-identified. We don't verify that in any way, shape, or form. But we do agree on one thing, and that is that we want to make sure that the integrity and the inclusivity of our democracy is such regardless of who you choose to vote for. And so we're very protective of that space. Across the country, we're about 1 million, about 1.3, 1.2 million. We've got offices in 30 states, and I lead the Minnesota office. And so I want to give a shout out to you all at Citizens League and Blue Cross Blue Shield and everybody else that really behind the scenes and in front of the scenes made this conversation happen. I think this is an amazing event, and I thank you so much for involving us.
Thank you, Anastasia. And part of what you said really connects to the next question that we're going to be exploring. And please, Lexi, if you want to pitch in, feel free to do so, but I'm going to bring it back to Kevin. What are the policy implications of redistricting in Minnesota, in the country, and what does it mean for different communities across the state?
Thanks, Blanca. I think maybe I'd start with the Minnesota implications in the country. You know, Alexi spoke about how we were able to maintain all 8 of our congressional seats, and that is very important for the state with our representation in Washington, D.C. We maintain our clout, our number of representatives who go to D.C. and represent the interests of not only their community, but of Minnesota as well. And it would have been really devastating for the state to lose that congressional district and be down to 7. And, you know, that's one fewer voice for Minnesotans in DC, in Congress, representing us. And so the implications, you know, again, it comes down to whether it's congressional seats or legislative seats. You know, we're electing folks to represent our interests, whether it's in DC or St. Paul. And when Lexi spoke about principles, you know, in Minnesota, we talk about wanting to have, you know, districts that are of convenient contiguous territory, keeping political subdivisions together. Essentially, we're talking about keeping like communities, people who think alike, together. And then, you know, in our representative democracy, we have a democratic republic, right? We all elect when we go and vote, we're voting for somebody to represent us. We're not voting on every issue. There's too many issues at the Capitol that come up for the everyday citizen to follow. So we're putting our trust in somebody that they're going to take all the information that is being presented in committee on the floor by interest groups and citizens. We want to make sure we have somebody that can take all that information and make good, wise decisions on behalf of the area in which we live. And so when we draw these maps and the districts, we want to make sure we have districts that represent your community, that you're not drawing maps that are I guess we're going to talk about gerrymandering down the road a little bit, but that's not something that we've seen in Minnesota, fortunately. But you want to make sure that districts are drawn to represent. I keep coming back to it. We're drawing maps so the districts represent a part of the state, and so it's important that when we draw these maps that we take into account the interests of even through greater Minnesota or the metro or even in the core cities. People have different interests, things that are of different importance, and so somebody who's representing Baudette will have the people they represent will have different interests than Lakeville or Minneapolis, right? And so we want to make sure that we're keeping communities together and that they have a voice in St. Paul that they can speak to somebody, their representative, to bring their issues to the Capitol. And it's really incumbent upon our elected officials to listen to the people that they are representing and bring those interests, those concerns to the Capitol and be a voice for all of the people that they're representing. So, in terms of the policy implications, right, it's making sure that you have somebody that represents your voice, your area, brings your concerns to St. Paul or to Washington, D.C. And, we spent a lot of time focusing on the highly partisan issues that come up. That's what grabs the headlines. But so much of the work that the legislature does or Congress does isn't at that partisan of a nature. And it's really about representing what is in the best interest. What do I think is in the best interest of my district? And that's why we want to make sure that we have districts, that represent the communities throughout Minnesota, whether it's greater Minnesota, metro, suburban, urban, rural.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Anastasia, do you want to chime into this question of what are the policy implications of redistricting in Minnesota, the country, and what does it mean for different communities across the state?
Yeah, Blanca, I would agree with Kevin's sort of summation on the sort of national scene with regards to policy impacts. So I'm going to direct my comments more on the local and what does that look like in Minnesota and how do communities maybe experience, these implications, these policy implications differently. I will say that something a lot of folks relate to when I engage communities is in this concept is that when you have a majority, for example, when you have a majority of Americans in the country wanting a specific thing, and something a lot of folks relate to that I've engaged is stricter gun laws or just gun laws, period, right? But Congress doesn't seem to budge on that, right? There's no progress one way, it's just like up at a wall. There's a disconnect. And as Kevin mentioned, elected officials' role is to be the advocate and the lobbyist of the people. So if you have a majority of America wanting a particular thing, whatever that thing may be, but you see the stalemate happening where there's no progress one way or another, no compromise, nothing that both sides can live with and none are walking away with everything, then you know that there's a disconnect, right? And so that's the policy implications of redistricting at a national and a very real local way. I think that here in Minnesota, we've seen that a lot. And although we hear a lot of our elected officials saying, well, that's what happens when you have a split government, right? When you have a split legislative body, you got one party with one side, one party with the other side, that's what happens, stalemate. I would disagree with that, because again, we just go back to what is the role, to Kevin's point, of our elected officials. That is to lobby and advocate for their constituents, right? And that opens up another can of worms with regards to representation, which is redistricting is at the core of, right? Which is, am I only speaking about the policies that impact a specific group, or is it the entire district, right? Because when you look at who pays for the salaries of our elected officials, not just who votes for them, but who's paying for those salaries, we're not looking at a scenario where my tax dollar only goes for the elected official who is affiliated with me. So there are some that argue that if you represent this district, you're representing all of the constituents of that district. And in fact, as Lexi mentioned, when the census is used to shape that district, it is everyone who is included in the district, not just a particular party or affiliation. And so just to kind of segue that into my next couple of comments is that electives are behaving many times in the opposite way that districts, their members want to see, because and Kevin, and we'll talk about this earlier, there might be issues of gerrymandering going on in that district. That's something that, you know, you could look at to see, is that where the disconnect is? Is it a disconnect around feeling disenfranchised and you don't have the voter turnout that you really should have? But that also speaks to other dynamics of representation. If you don't feel that you can see your values, your life experiences, your concerns being included in the policy and the agendas that elected officials are moving, then why would I be motivated to show up and to vote, right? Why would I be motivated? So it's a domino effect in many ways you see the implications at a policy level. And the fact is that when elected officials are put into office because of how a particular map is drawn, then that also means that they're moving an agenda and policies that don't end. They don't end when that elected official is gone. They don't end when, as Lexi mentioned, there's another redistricting cycle 10 years later. The impact of who is pushing what policies are felt at a community grassroots level, at like a kitchen table level for generations, not just, you know, for a particular period or until a particular elected official is gone, right, from that position, right? Those are things that we're still feeling rippling through. I'm gonna skip, I was thinking of mentioning something about the court's role because it's been such an inherent part of how redistricting has been done in Minnesota and who has actually have been doing it for the last 5 to 6 cycles or so. But I think I'm gonna leave those comments to the part where we talk about partisan gerrymandering. The last comment I'm gonna make on that goes to how democracy is experienced, because redistricting is not, or the census rather, is not just about the money and the resources. It's, as you know, as Lexi walked us, it's about how representation and political power is given. And the thought I want to leave this section of the discussion on is the following. As Kevin mentioned, the state of Minnesota literally hung on, clung on to its 8th congressional seat through the growth of BIPOC communities in the state of Minnesota. And that's something that Susan Broward, our state demographer, testified to and presented to both chambers on with regards to where is the growth in the state of Minnesota happening. And for those of us that have actually followed how many people, how many like heads literally saved us, I'm just gonna, what do you call it? Guesstimate it, because I didn't bring my notes on that, but it was something like less than 20 people in the state of Minnesota were literally the reasons why we hung on to that seat. So then the question is the following. When you see a specific demographic in the state of Minnesota driving the growth for the last couple of census cycles, and in fact, outgrew the estimated guesses this time around, and you see the same demographic really re-injecting economic growth within pockets of greater Minnesota that previously were essentially dying out, right? And we think about where is the political the representation of that group in the policies that are coming out. And you continue to see those headlines that nationally, the state of Minnesota is one of 3 in the worst, and you fill in the blank. Education, home ownership for BIPOC communities, wealth, building of wealth for BIPOC communities. There's a disconnect, right? There's a definite disconnect there. And so I just want to leave folks with that thought in mind as we're thinking about the other dynamics and the other questions around redistricting and fair representation for how all Minnesotans are experiencing democracy.
Thank you, Anastasia. And I do want to make sure that we are conscientious of the time. I know that we can possibly spend a long time talking about this. I do want to give Kevin an opportunity to respond. I think he had some comments in response to Anastasia's answers. And then after that, I do want to move on to gerrymandering, because I do see questions coming in through the chat, and I want to make sure that we also have time to discuss those. So go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, thanks, Blanca. I won't be too long here. I feel it's important we think about what your elected representatives, how they're representing you, whether it's in St. Paul or Washington, D.C. And you can bring up issues like Anastasia brought up constitutional gun issues. Certainly the other side might suggest that using a photo ID to vote is a majority of Americans support that, and nothing has moved forward, at least in Minnesota, on that type of an issue. But what it comes down to again is we're electing folks to listen to all sides of the issue on those controversial issues and make a decision based on what they believe is best for their constituents. And the wonderful thing about how our founding fathers set up this democratic republic is, every 2 to 4 years, 6 years, you have an opportunity to select new leaders if you don't think that they are being represented. And so the redistricting process is really about putting those districts together that represent certain particular, we're the 12th largest state, by size in Minnesota. And, our legislature needs to represent all areas of Minnesota. And that's what the redistricting process is about.
Thank you, Kevin. So because there seems to be some interest in having a conversation about what is gerrymandering. So if we want to move into that question, one of the questions that I did see in the chat was, the 6th Congressional District looks gerrymandered. How can a person tell whether their district is gerrymandered or not? So the question that I had is, what is gerrymandering and what are some risks of this happening here in the state? So I don't know if Kevin or Anastasia want to take a stab, or Alexis, if you want to give a quick just background of what gerrymandering is.
Yeah, I'll jump in first with the easy part of this and say what gerrymandering is, and then Kevin and Anastasia can handle the rest of that. So gerrymandering is just a term that we use to describe a plan that's intentionally drawn to advantage one group or party over another group. And oftentimes these look to have a bizarre shape. So the 2 most common types of gerrymandering are political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. And to answer the question of how do we know, I'll just say it's really complicated, and it's probably going to involve litigation. There's a lot of Supreme Court opinions and tests that look at, whether who lives there, how it's figured out, how the lines are drawn, what are the other factors. So it's super complicated. And the courts will probably be the ones to tell you if it's gerrymandered or not. So I'll leave it at that and let the others take over.
I'll jump in. Yeah, thanks, Blanca and Lexi. I'll jump in terms. I think that's the the dictionary definition of gerrymander, and you can see it. You'll see it in other states, and where it would typically happen is in a state that has one-party control of the legislature and the governor. We haven't had that in Minnesota. The courts have drawn the last 3 maps. The last map that was, the last map that was drawn by a legislative body was in 1991. Democrats controlled both the House and Senate, drew a map. Republican Governor Arnie Carlson was intending to veto it, but got the rules wrong on vetoing it, and so that legislatively drawn map became law. I think a good way to know that Minnesota's, I would argue none of our districts are gerrymandered. They've been drawn by the courts, but also looking at the elasticity of the last few election cycles. And when I say that, I mean how much power flips between the parties. I think our congressional districts are the most elastic in the country in terms of having the congressional districts flip from Republican to Democrat. And you'll see in the state legislature, particularly in the House, where every member of the Minnesota House is up every 2 years. And a majority typically is 2 to 4 years, and then it flips. And that wouldn't happen if you had gerrymandered districts. If you had gerrymandered districts, they're done for when a legislature draws them is to keep political power, and they would draw districts that are advantageous to them. But we see particularly, demographics change, and in Minnesota, people vote for who they think is going to best represent them. And so I think you see a lot more people switching which party they vote for, because they're voting for who they think best represents them. And so I would argue we don't have that issue here in Minnesota, because we've seen the party switch, the party in control of the legislative bodies switch.
Thank you, Kevin. Anastasia, what do you think? What is, we have heard the definition of gerrymandering, but what do you think are some of the risks of this happening here in Minnesota?
So I would not be as confident as Kevin is with regards to the matter of gerrymandering. I think it depends. I will clarify that the redistricting happens at multiple levels of government, not just congressional or state. So when we think of the question of gerrymandering, we have to think about local redistricting and, gerrymandering at a county level, at a city level, right? Many boards, many park boards, many school boards are also redistricted. And so I will say that I can point to a particular example that, in my opinion, I would definitely do a little more digging into to see whether what I'm looking at is an example of partisan gerrymandering, because to Lexi's point, there are different types of gerrymandering, whether there's partisan or racial gerrymandering. One area that we're looking into that we heard complaints on was the way that Olmsted County districts literally take a piece of the city of Rochester. Every single commissioner, the county commissioner, has a piece of the city of Rochester. So the question is, what happens to the collective political power of the constituents of the city of Rochester in moving an issue that they care about? Is it a matter of having then to convince every single one of those, county board members, county commissioners rather, to agree to take up an issue that they care about? Because literally that's what they'd have to do, right? Instead of, other districts. And again, I want to caveat and say that this is a complaint we've gotten, and so we're looking into, as they're now in the middle of, redistricting and getting ready for it and kind of having those public hearings. So, do we have the examples like in Illinois where the Democrats are the ones gerrymandering the heck, right, out of their districts? Or do we have a situation like in Georgia or in other states that I would argue is like poster child for partisan gerrymandering, the Republican side, right? I don't know. We don't have those kinds of sexy examples in the state of Minnesota, but to the point of speaking to gerrymandering, it's a matter of, is it gerrymandered or not how badly is it gerrymandered. So that's what I would say. As far as like whether we have fair maps because the courts have drawn them, I have a definite strong position on that, because the court's role is not the same as the role of legislators. When legislators under the Minnesota Constitution are sitting down and trying to come up with redistricting principles and maps that respond to constituents, that is different. Their role is to advocate and fight for, right, the interests of their constituency. That's not the court's role. in drawing maps. And so to try to equate those two things and say that the constituents of the state of Minnesota are truly experiencing the best maps that they can get, I would argue not. The best maps that the constituents of the state of Minnesota can get are those created by the people whose job it is to advocate, lobby, consider, have those tough conversations, have those tough negotiations, include the public, right? Have a transparent and open process. That to me would yield the, not perfect, but the best scenario for the state of Minnesota. Having the court move through until, I would argue this time around, they've done it differently, but in the past it's been drawing maps from a least change approach. And least change doesn't work for all Minnesotans, because least change means that you look at districts and then you're just sort of tweaking here and there to account for just numbers. And representation isn't just about numbers. It's about the people who are living and working and doing business in these districts. So I would argue no. The courts do the best that they can with the very limited role that they have, but it is not the same, and we should not be comparing those two as if somehow maps coming from the courts and maps coming from a legislative body are going to be the same quality maps as far as representation. It's just not the same thing.
Thank you, Anastasia. And I think because we are running out of time, I want to make sure that we can hear as to what comes next. I know that you will be receiving a survey, and we really appreciate you filling that out so that we can create a better experience and learn from these mind openers. And one quick question that I have, I want to make sure that all of you leave with the tools to really engage, is when should we expect the special redistricting panel to issue maps? Will that be on February 15, Lexi?
Well, I think that depends on what the legislature does. If the legislature
Okay.
gets plans enacted by then, there won't be any maps from the court. The legislative plan will be it. If the legislature misses that deadline, I don't know exactly when they'll release it, but based on past years, probably within a day or two of the 15th, after the 15th.
Okay, great. And if I can hear from all the panelists, what is one thing that people can do to stay engaged in this process? What is it that they could do even after this session? What could they do to engage and to be informed? So I'll start with you, Lexi.
Yeah, I come at it, like I said, from more of a legal scholarly perspective, but I think this can be such a flashpoint issue about, people care about one piece of it, and redistricting is such a balancing act, right? Like if you look at one thing and ignore everything else, it's going to be really hard to draw a map. So I think it's helpful for people to look beyond maybe the one issue they care about the most, and maybe look at some of the things around that to sort of get a bigger perspective of all of the pieces and kind of how they work together.
Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, I guess I would encourage everybody to stay engaged. We are at the end of the process here, right? February 15th is the constitutional deadline. The legislature's already drawn their maps. The House has a map, the Senate has a map. The courts, if no compromise is made, the courts will come out with theirs in the middle of February. But the legislature always has the power, the authority to tweak, to redraw. It's the legislature's role if they ever. And it's happened in the past after the courts have drawn the maps in 2001 and 2011 that there needed to be some changes to the maps. So keep an eye through the legislature, their website, issues on how the maps are coming out. If you see something, certainly once the maps are out, you can still engage with your legislator in terms of having a conversation with them about what's important, because the maps can be tweaked and or changed.
Thank you, Kevin. Anastasia, how can people stay involved?
I would say that I'd like people to walk away from here, with the reinforced message that redistricting is about people, not parties or politicians. And that means that there is still time, as a matter of fact, for you to engage in local redistricting. So I really encourage folks to look up your counties and look up your cities. And cities redistrict first after the legislature or the courts submit the plans. The Secretary of State's office will inform that to local government, and cities will kick off. There are hearings right now. Counties will do it last. And so you can still engage at that level, but don't let the legislature off the hook either. Call your senators, call your House reps, and ask them, what have you done to put us in your district first, right? Call your senators. What have you done to include us? What have you done to communicate with us? Same thing with the House. Hold power accountable is something so easy to do. Make them work for your vote.
Thank you, Anastasia. And we did see a lot of really amazing questions come through the chat. I did share my email. Feel free to send me an email with your question. We'll do our best to gather some information, maybe do some follow-up with the panelists to get their perspective. So, and there's also a lot of information that is being shared in the chat. So feel free to take a look at some of those links. And again, it seems like Anastasia is mentioning that she's happy to respond to questions offline. But if you have any questions directly, I did share my email. Feel free to send them to me. Again, thank you for all the panelists. Thank you for being here with us. And I'm going to pass it on to Kate. Thank you so much for all your participation and your great questions.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today and for a great conversation. We were laughing as a group, the panel, before we started, that we could talk until 7 o'clock tonight about this topic. And it is true. There's so much to talk about. So thanks, everyone, for your patience. I know it was a quick hour. It went by in the blink of an eye. Please respond to the Citizens League survey. We've put the link twice in the chat. We would love to know what you thought about this event and a little more about you. As I said in the beginning, you are a part of the Citizens League by being here today. Your participation, your engagement in these issues is so important to us, to our communities, and to our future. So thank you very much for coming today. A big thanks to Blanca and all our panelists today. Thanks for being here. Appreciate you. We're working out some logistics in the chat here about the firewalls on the survey. So we'll keep working on that. And thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Take care, everybody.